Well, welcome back to another installment of Words with Friends. Tonight, the word is grace. And as we're going to discover, that word is very closely tied to the word gifts.
Yes.
And so I thought we would start tonight by talking about maybe the most generous, most precious, most exciting gift you ever got. I can think of several, but I'll give you this one as an example. One year for Christmas, I got a handmade t-shirt quilt. And Rhonda took all of my t-shirts from my first youth group. So 8 years of working with this group, imagine all the t-shirts that generated.
Mm-hmm. Right.
And she made a quilt out of that, and she did it all by hand, and she did it in secret. But the problem was she didn't tell me she was working on this, so I would come home from work, and the house would be a mess, or no dinner was made. I was like, this was before kids, and so I was like, what have you been doing? You just sitting around watching the soap operas, watching your stories. And then
It's
Christmas,
a good marriage story right
then
there.
Christmas came, and I had to open up this quilt, and I felt terrible and great all at the same time. But you know, it's a priceless gift. I wouldn't take any money for that gift because it was that awesome. What about you guys? Awesome gifts, generous gifts, precious gifts. If you say kids, you're right out of here.
Well,
you're
those,
right out.
they are precious gifts, but no.
I will bring up my kids.
Okay.
I have one of my grandfather's pocket watches. That's really important to me.
Whoa.
And I didn't know, like, this was one of the things, he had a whole list of things he wanted to give to his grandkids.
Yes.
And it was kind of like, here's the things I want to leave, you pick what you want type of thing. And I didn't know he had pocket
Was he
watches.
even sick? I mean, did you
No,
know?
this was
Yeah.
well before he
Oh.
died.
So sad.
No, but now I have it, and he has since passed, and it's very important to me, and it'll be something that I tell, like, my kids who will have never met him about when they're old enough.
So top that, Luke.
So
You
since
got
we're
nothing.
going down the sentimental
You got nothing.
road, my first Game Boy Pocket when I was like 5. It was fantastic. You know, the ones that you played, but like when it was a good system because it was before like backlight was invented. So like if it was
sure.
dark,
You can play
you
it.
couldn't
Yeah.
play it. So like I remember like in the car on car rides at night, like driving and like light would come by and you're like, oh, move, and you're just waiting for the next bit of light. Yeah, it's a great gift.
So if we're going to define grace as a gift given, let's talk about that. Maybe we need a better definition. Let's broaden that definition. When I say grace, what do you think of? How do we define that?
Yeah, I think when I was thinking about grace and how do you define grace, and it's, especially in the context of it being a gift, I don't know. It's that It's something that we would not have come up with ourselves as
That's true.
humans.
That's true.
We would have never. The concept of grace would have
No.
never
No.
come by us because we think about, well,
Ourselves.
what am I going to get out
Right.
of it?
Well, and it's also because it's completely unmerited.
Yes.
Right.
So we think of things that we get that we deserve. We worked for, we earned. Well, of course you'd give that to me because I'm a great person.
Right.
But grace is that type of gift that you just kind of blows your mind that you're like, I didn't even know I wanted this, or I didn't
Right.
even know I needed this.
Right.
And so it's not like there's a list somewhere
Right.
of the things you wanted and God went, well, I'm going to give you grace because that's at the top of your list.
Right.
What else as far as the cost? This grace that was given to us freely, what was the cost of that grace?
Right. We talk about this idea of this free grace, but it wasn't free.
No.
It
No.
came at a cost. And so this cool thing that I saw was, the acronym GRACE, God's riches at Christ's expense. And so we get the glory of God, but through the sacrifice
Right.
of Christ.
It's I guess you could say it's a priceless gift that cost an awful lot.
Yes.
Right? We wouldn't take anything for it, but it was very expensive. Maybe a priceless gift that's very expensive.
Yes.
It's extravagant. We'll come back and talk all about grace.
If you tried to describe what God is like, it could be difficult or daunting. But when the people who wrote the Bible pondered the mystery of God, they consistently describe God's character in this way: compassionate and gracious, slow to anger, overflowing with loyal love and faithfulness. We're going to look at the second key word in this statement, gracious. The Hebrew word is chanun, which is related to the Hebrew noun chen. This word, chen, is often translated as grace or favor, and if you study how this word is used throughout the Bible, you find a fascinating story. One meaning of chen is delightful or favorable. In the Psalms, a skilled poet is said to have lips of chen, That is, he can craft beautiful words that bring delight. Or a dazzling piece of jewelry is an ornament of chen. It attracts attention and favor. This is why chen is often the word used to describe a gift given with delight or favor. In these cases, chen could be translated as grace. Like in the story of Esther, who approaches the king of Persia to ask that she and her people be spared from death. She calls this a request for chen. And because the king delights in Esther, he favors her and grants her wish. So, giving a gift of favor is chen because it's motivated by delight. And the most extreme kind of chen is showing favor to someone who should get what they deserve, not a generous gift. Like Jacob, who cheated his brother Esau, ran away, and then after 20 years wants to come back and make things right. So he comes to Esau asking, "May I find chen in your eyes?" Jacob isn't asking for what is fair, but for favor. And surprisingly, that's what Esau gives him. He chooses to delight in his brother Jacob and show him grace that he doesn't deserve. Now, chen requires a generous spirit, which people sometimes have. But in the Bible, the one who shows more chen than anyone else is God. Like when God rescued the Israelites out of slavery in Egypt, and they quickly betray him by giving their allegiance to a golden idol as their God. But then, Moses steps in and asks God to consider giving a gift that they don't deserve. And God says yes, by showing the ultimate act of chen, forgiveness and a promise to be with these people. This character trait of God is so reliable that over 40 times in the book of Psalms, people cry out for God's chen when they're sick or in danger, or when the Israelites are in exile. And the biblical prophets like Isaiah looked back to God's chen in the past and boldly declared that God will one day show chen to his people by delivering them and all creation from death and ruin. Now, when we turn to the authors of the New Testament, they describe God's chen with the Greek word charis, which means gracious gift. Like when we're introduced to Jesus in the Gospel of John, we're told that Jesus is God's glorious charis become human, sent into a world of people trapped in darkness and death. Because according to the Apostle Paul, we're like the living dead. God has handed humanity over to the destructive consequences of our selfish decisions. But, Paul says, God is rich in mercy, and by his charis, he's rescued us. He's talking about how Jesus' life, death, and resurrection are offered to us as a generous gift of life that is more powerful than death. And as with any gift, all one has to do is receive it. So, now you can see why the biblical authors talk so much about this description of God's character throughout the Bible. When people are willing to own their failures and ask God for chen, he has a consistent and generous response. God gives the gift of himself, his life, and his love. And this is what it means that God is gracious.
All right, so good video, right? Great video. All right, so what stuck out to you guys in that video?
I liked that so many of the examples of grace were Old Testament, and I know we're talking about the Old Testament verb first, but I guess if I think of grace, I'm so tied to Christ and the cross and an amazing grace, and the kind of grace that I think about are not these Old Testament stories. So there was a richness to the story of Esau, to the story of Esther, like so many different parallels there that you're like, oh yeah, that makes a whole lot of sense.
Yeah.
There is a quote at the end of the video, and you're going to get to this probably later, but there's a quote that each time I watched it stuck out to me, and it was, once we own up to our failures, that's when grace comes in. It's not a catch-all. It's not a, well, God's grace is going to, take care of that. It's, you have to do some of the work too.
Right.
And that really struck a chord with me, because I think we think of grace as a Band-Aid.
Well, it's like almost grace can't work until we know we need it.
Right.
Right.
And so as long as we're saying, no, I'll earn it, or I'll work for it, or I'm a pretty good person compared to the person next to me, then grace doesn't really work. Grace has to be this thing that we accept as unmerited. I can't get it. You're bridging a gap that I couldn't think to get across.
Yeah, I think also it's like you kind of touched on it, was the Jacob and Esau story. I think that after hearing it through the lens of Esau and this idea that man, when grace was, like you just said, very unmerited, and just how it was bestowed upon him. And I think kind of what you said is we don't realize that we need grace until we are in that depth. And so I think from 2 Corinthians 12:9 said, "But he said to me, my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness." So when we're in that valley, therefore I will boast more gladly about my weaknesses, so that Christ's power may rest on me. And so when I think of grace now, I tend to think when it's not anything else I can do, when I am pure out of it, that's when Christ steps in. And we're going to talk about this a little bit later, but when we call upon Christ, it feels like we only call upon him when we feel that weakness come in.
There's this old hymn we used to sing. I don't know if y'all would even remember this. It was called "All of Self, None of Thee," and I think in four verses, it goes from all of self, none of thee, some of self, some of thee, less of self, more of thee, and then at last the final verse is none of self, all of thee. And I was talking with some friends the other day, ministers, and they're like, I'll never forget. One guy led that one night as a closing song and only led the first verse. And
Oh, no.
it doesn't work like that song.
Right.
Doesn't work if you go all of self and none of thee.
Right.
Like it would work as the last verse.
Right.
Yeah.
But yeah, that my strength is made perfect in your weakness. That's
Right.
that's brilliant.
Right.
Let's go back to that Esau story, Luke. I'll read it here. This is Genesis 33:8. Esau asked, "What's the meaning of all these flocks and herds I met, and to find favor in your eyes, my Lord?" he said. And so, give me a little bit of that story there. What's going on?
Right. It will, we know the story about the birthright and Jacob and Esau. But what I find interesting, back to the video, was it defined grace as a gift given with delight. Meaning, meaning it wasn't a gift given because I felt bad for you, so it wasn't with pity that I give you this gift of grace. It was because I delight in giving grace.
Well, or even out of fear. Jacob was pretty sure that Esau was going to come and kill him.
Yep.
Right.
Like that was the whole exchange here.
Yeah.
And instead, Jacob says, well, what if instead of taking a defensive position, I take just this...
Give everything.
And he calls him Lord.
Yes.
I thought that was interesting too.
Yeah. So it's just the idea of not what's fair, but with favor. And so, a couple of questions. So why do you think we so often go after what is fair in our eyes instead of that offer of extending grace?
Well, fair is about debts. It's what's owed. It's what I can line up and say, this many hours, this much pay.
Right.
I did this much. This was the contract. We said this. These are agreed upon terms. Grace is really putting yourself in the hands or at the mercy of that other person.
Yeah.
And so there's no contract to enforce. It's Jacob maybe leaning his head down, bowing down to his brother and saying, if you want, you can take my head. And so now we're literally at the mercy of that person. So if God is a good God, a God who loves us, then here comes grace.
Right.
If God is a God who's just a God of justice and order, then we're in trouble.
Right. Yeah. And so how do we change that mindset? How do we get from what's owed to me is owed to me to this idea of not just grace once, but grace 1,000 times?
I think you have to look at, like I was thinking about the parable of the unmerciful servant and how, like, you've got to figure out who you are in that story.
Right.
That you're the one that's been forgiven tens of thousands, a lifetime of debt. And if you go about your life thinking you've been forgiven so much, then you're going to extend grace to so many people. But if you're going, there's so much more people that are just getting away with, and or if you're kind of like the bitter older brother, I've been here the whole time.
Right.
I've done all the right things. You never even gave me a calf to have a party with my friends. And it's all about realizing your own need for God's unmerited grace.
Yeah. You have anything, Leah?
No, I think it is inherent in humanity to worry about you not getting your own fair shake. Like, at the end of the day, you worry, am I going to get what I deserve? Right. And so it is hard to, as you said, think about what you already have been given. as opposed to what you will continue to get.
Right.
And I think it is crazy difficult to think about anybody else's needs without knowing what you're going to have first.
Yeah.
Have you ever had the experience of working for somebody and they ask you, well, what do I owe you for that?
Mm-hmm.
Like, I remember as a kid going over and doing odd jobs, cleaning out some flower beds, and this lady said, well, what do I owe you for that? And I said, oh, just whatever you think is fair. Like, I didn't want to be the one to set the price.
Mm-hmm.
And it's funny how, like, I've been burned on that and been like, well, here's a shiny quarter,
Right.
kid, you know? And then other times you're like, oh, I would have never asked.
Right.
No.
Like, that was just over and abundant and beyond.
Mm-hmm.
But it comes down to, I want to say, the character or the generosity of the other party. And that's scary. That is scary to say, well, you just give me what you think, you know, what you think is fair.
Right.
Like, if you got into a car accident tomorrow and they said, hey, I don't have any insurance. And you're like, okay, well, we'll just settle up. You just give me what you think, you know, like is fair for me to repair my car.
Right.
I wouldn't sleep. Right?
No.
I would be
Right.
terrified.
Yeah.
Right.
All right, so back to the video. It quotes this. It says, "People of the Bible call out to God when they are sick, in danger, or in exile." So when do you see yourself, kind of going back to what we talked about earlier, calling out to God the most? We talked about in our weakness. That's usually when we find ourselves. I think that's for me. I think I usually call out when I see things are going off of the path that I set out for me. When things start to veer, I'm like, whoa, God, you know, you're supposed to be helping me out here.
When I'm completely out of my depth,
Yes.
when I don't have any means to control, you might have heard some people crying out during the election because they felt like no matter how they voted or who they voted for, that God has to control this, or
Right.
the pandemic.
Mm-hmm.
In the times when we go, I can't write a check to get myself out of this. I can't play the law card and go, well, the law reads this. There's nothing at my disposal that will get me out of this trouble.
Right.
Yep.
That's when I call out to God.
Yep.
So how do we easily treat this idea of grace as a get out of jail free card?
I think you've got to be careful with that because, again, if you look at the price, it was that idea of cheap grace
Right.
that
Yes.
we talked about Sunday,
Right.
that Bonhoeffer so beautifully defines of like, if it's all just about getting and not about what you're putting into it,
Right.
or reflexively what you're going to do,
Right.
not because you're earning it, but if all it is about you getting forgiveness, getting acceptance, getting out of punishment, and not about changing my heart and changing my habits and changing my life,
Right.
then you've really got to question whether or not you're getting grace.
Right.
Right.
Because I don't even think that is grace.
No.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's easy to fool ourselves. It's really easy to talk ourselves into bad situations when we have the fallback of, oh, well, his grace is sufficient, you know?
Yes.
He'll cover all our
yeah.
things, you know? And so if I mess up this one time, you know, the grace will cover that. And we kind of use that as we talked about a while ago of, well, if I do 3 good things for the Lord, I can do 1 bad and those trump, you know?
Right.
And so I think we treat grace the same way. Well, I gave to church, I gave 11%, so I overtithed, really.
Right.
And so now that 1% of extra will cover me. So yeah, I think that it's tricky when we talk about grace to keep in mind that it's freely given because there was a cost paid, and that we should live up to that cost. We should want to pay it back, even though it was
Yes.
freely given. You know, when something's freely given to you, and you still feel like, well, I should still do something, you know, for them. It's kind of like well, what do you feel like you owe, you know?
Well, and sometimes it's not about paying that person back, but maybe just paying it forward.
Right.
Yes.
Of saying, hey, I was blessed. You know, I got this one. I didn't think I needed it, and so here, let me pay that forward with you.
Right.
I can see that as a great motivator.
Yes.
So we talked about how usually when we think about grace, we think about New Testament with Jesus. But here we go back to Isaiah, Old Testament. Leo, where you read Isaiah 30, 18 and 19.
Yet the Lord longs to be gracious to you. Therefore he will rise up to show you compassion. For the Lord is a God of justice. Blessed are all who wait for him. People of Zion who live in Jerusalem, you will weep no more. How gracious he will be when you cry out for help. As soon as he hears, he will answer you.
All right, so what do you hear in Isaiah 30?
I like the idea that he's going to rise up.
Mm-hmm.
Like, it's God moving first. It's God giving first. He's not waiting for us.
Yeah.
And then there's that balance of he's a God of justice. Like, he understands
Mm-hmm.
that something's out of balance. He understands that there's an offense that's been made, but he's going to set that right with grace, not
Right.
justice. That's
Right.
pretty amazing.
I do still like that you have to do something in order for him to show up.
Yes.
It's not going to be automatic. You have to say, I need you, in
Yes.
order for him to
Oh,
come
as soon
to
as
you.
he hears you, he will
Yes.
answer you.
Right.
Yes.
Or even waiting.
Yeah.
Like, waiting
Yes.
is something, like, where you think, if he asks you to do something really hard, would you do it? Well, what if it was waiting?
Right.
That
Yeah.
might be the hardest thing he asks you to do is nothing.
Yeah.
Right.
I like the beginning. It says the Lord longs to be gracious
Yeah,
to
he wants
you.
this.
He wants it. And I think
Yeah.
a lot of the time we do the opposite. We run away when we mess up. We try to hide. We try to bury it, push it under the rug. And all he's doing is saying, I'm just waiting to be gracious. Just ask for forgiveness. And I've been waiting
Right.
to give this forgiveness. So Ephesians 2:8 says, for it is by grace you have been saved through faith, and it is not from yourselves, but is a gift of God. So we talked about earlier that grace is a gift we must receive. So what does that mean to you?
Oh, well, you cut it off. As it continues, he says, so that we can't boast.
Right.
I love that. Like, there's nothing in the grace that I'm thinking, look at all this grace I got. You know, like, I kind of figured it out. Like, I asked him, and he gave me the grace. That's great. Like, there's nothing.
Right.
There's nothing about myself in the grace of God. It's all the grace of God.
Right.
It's what he's given to me. I love that idea.
Yeah. Going back, when I think of a gift, it's he put it on the table, but until we open it up and really dive into what grace is, right? It's this gift that's been given, but until we fully understand, until we receive it ourselves, we'll never understand what it is and then once we know what it is, we can give it back, right? We give that grace back to people once we understand what it looks like coming from God.
We have, I don't know if you have had this in your house, but we have what I call COVID Christmas presents. They're still wrapped. I have no idea.
Oh my
I've even
goodness.
forgotten. Yeah, but I remember, like, right before, the weeks before Christmas, my boys were just, like, wanting to know what this one, and every time a new gift would show up, they'd kind of look at it and examine it and what could be this. Well, because of COVID, we've put off Christmas with Rhonda's side of the family.
Oh, that's
And
funny.
those presents are still under there, and I thought, those presents aren't even really presents
Right.
because they haven't been opened.
Mm-hmm.
And grace is a gift that unless you open it, it's just as good as those presents that are still. And we don't have our tree up. I don't want you to think that we're Philistines, but they're still there. They're still unwrapped. They're still waiting.
And I think the other part of that is once you have opened it, it's impossible to ignore it.
Yeah.
You have to not only accept it, but it has to do something to your heart. It can't be, you can't be exactly the same after that. Otherwise, like you said, it cheapens it.
Yeah.
It's not real.
Yeah.
And that's the hardest part.
Yeah. All right. So closing thoughts on grace. What do you got?
Open your gifts.
Open your gifts. Leah?
I don't know. I think all of this comes back to you have to admit what you've done first.
Yeah.
Like it cannot be as amazing and wonderful of a gift if you don't first do that step. And that changes the entire concept of grace for me.
It's unmerited, but it's not unnecessary.
Right.
Like, for some people, they're like, well, I don't need grace. I'm a pretty good person.
Yeah.
Ugh.
Yeah. And I would say just go back to that Jacob and Esau story, and instead of looking for what's fair in the world, look
Yeah.
how you can give favor to the world. Because I think that the world is going to wrong you time and time again.
Yep.
And
that is just another opportunity for you to show favor with God's people.
Good thoughts. Good lesson. Hey, stay well, stay safe, stay warm.
Yes.
Hopefully, as you're enjoying this in the warmth of your own home, be blessed, and we'll see you on Sunday.